46 years ago, on a rainy April night in 1958, a man in Macon, Georgia, vanished right from his own porch, leaving behind a still-warm lighter and a half-finished Moscow Mule in the sink. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, just an absolute disappearance that plunged the entire community into fear and confusion. The police suspected the wife, but lacking evidence, the case quickly went cold and was filed away as a mysterious missing person. Then, for nearly half a century afterward, the matter faded into oblivion, until a young GBI detective reopened the old file and uncovered details that previous generations had overlooked. An old check, an unlabeled bottle of white powder, and a copper mug still faintly smelling of metal. From those seemingly meaningless clues, she gradually unraveled the entire story. A chain of lies, poisoning, and secrets buried under layers of concrete for decades, leading to a truth that no one in Macon could have imagined. Before diving deep into this shocking case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe justice never dies with time, don't forget to hit subscribe to follow the next stories. The night of April 17, 1958. A light drizzle fell over the suburbs of Macon, Georgia, covering everything in a damp chill of southern spring. In the small wooden house by Lake Tobsov Key, the porch light cast down onto the wet wooden floor, reflecting into trembling streaks of light every time the wind gusted through. Harold Whitman, 39 years old, a well-known building contractor in the area, had just wrapped up a long day with a Moscow Mule that his wife Clara had mixed for him. The scent of ginger, lime, and vodka mingled with the rainy air, making the room unusually warm. They had just discussed the contract to buy the land by the lake, a major turning point in Harold's career. He gave a gentle smile, his voice hoarse, as he said, "I'm gonna step out on the porch for a smoke and be right back in." A simple, light remark, and that was the last time Clara heard her husband's voice. 11:50, Clara could still see her husband through the window frame. 12:30, that light vanished. She wiped her hands, stepped out onto the porch, hearing only the rain and the croaking of frogs echoing from the lake. The wooden chair was empty, cigarette ash scattered on the floor, thin smoke curling around the legs. No muddy footprints, no water trails, no signs that anyone had just gone anywhere. She called softly, "Harold?" Then louder, "Harold, where are you?" Only the wind and rain answered. The air began to thicken, time seeming to stop. A sense of unease rose from her stomach. Clara threw on a thin sweater, grabbed a flashlight, and scanned the yard. The weak beam swept over the pine trees, wet grass, and the dirt path leading to the gate. Everything was eerily quiet. She circled the house, the shed door still locked, Harold's Ford still in the garage, his wristwatch on the table by the entrance, still ticking steadily. Everything was in its place, except the man had vanished. Outside, the rain grew heavier by the minute, pattering on the porch roof and wooden railing. The wind whistling through the door cracks sounded like someone's breath standing in the dark. The wall clock struck 12:30, then 12:35, then 1. Clara stopped in the middle of the living room, looking around, her palms slick with cold sweat. She walked to the wall-mounted phone, paused for a few seconds, then picked up the receiver. A faint static hum from the long-distance lines crackled on the other end. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the Bibb County night desk. The man's voice on duty, hoarse and still sleepy, came through. "Bibb County Station. How can I help?" Clara tried to stay calm, her voice choking. "My husband. He stepped out on the porch to smoke and didn't come back. I've searched around the house. He's nowhere." There was silence on the line for a moment, then a question. "Did he take the car?" "No, the car's still here. All his things are here." A long pause hung amid the sound of falling rain. Then the desk sergeant softly replied, "I'll send someone over." The patter of rain on the porch roof continued unabated as Clara set the receiver down. Outside, the wind from Lake Tobsov Key blew stronger, making the porch light sway slightly, its yellow glow slanting across the wet wooden floor. The small house now held only her ragged breathing and the ticking clock in the living room. Less than half an hour later, police car headlights tore through the murky night. Sheriff Ed Lawson arrived at the scene at 2 in the morning. His wide-brimmed hat was soaked, water dripping onto the ground as he stepped over the threshold. The musty scent of nighttime rain mingled with the lingering spicy ginger aroma in the air. Clara stood huddled by the door, her face ashen, lips trembling, eyes wide as if no longer recognizing reality. Lawson gave a short nod, said little, pulled a flashlight from his belt, and swept its beam across the porch. On the wooden floor, rainwater had pooled into irregular streaks. The light stopped at faint boot prints running along from the steps to the grass. Steady steps, spaced about 20 inches apart, then abruptly halting in the middle of the open ground. No signs of turning back, no skid marks, nothing indicating the wearer of those boots had continued walking. Lawson crouched down, his calloused hand lightly touching the indented soil, feeling the crushed and sodden grass. The rain hadn't been heavy enough to erase the prints, yet the boot marks vanished midway, like someone had been lifted off the ground. He quietly circled the yard, the light sweeping over the drenched trees, the fence, then pausing at the dirt path leading toward the lake. No tire tracks, no fresh mud streaks, just soft ground pounded by rainwater. Everything was eerily silent. When he returned inside, Lawson paused at the sink. On it sat a copper mug. Inside remained a few cloudy drops of liquid, the rim smeared faintly. He leaned in closer, sniffed lightly. Ginger, vodka, lime, and a faint, icy metallic tang. The kitchen was unnaturally spotless, dishes washed, dining table bare, tablecloth neatly folded. Everything arranged with care as if nothing had happened just hours before. He opened the back door, looking out onto the porch. The light still cast a faint yellow glow down onto the wood. Rain fell in a thin veil, blending with the hum of insects and sweeping wind. Under that flickering light, the house took on a strangely cold detachment. Lawson crossed the living room. The chair where Harold had sat still bore an indentation on the cushion. His copper lighter placed on the side table, and fresh cigarette ash scattered on the ashtray. No signs of a struggle or disturbance, yet everything exuded an inexplicable emptiness, as if the man had simply vanished mid-breath. Outside, the police car's headlights beamed through the window frame, illuminating Clara's pallid face, her eyes dry and hollow. She stood still, gazing out at the porch, hands clutching the hem of her nightgown. Lawson watched her for a long moment, then glanced at his watch, the minute hand edging past 3. Dawn hadn't broken yet, but in his mind, this case already had its own shape. A man vanishing into a rainy night, no traces of departure, an overly tidy kitchen, and a hastily rinsed copper mug. Out there, the rain fell steadily, the dark lake seeming to swallow all light. As Lawson stepped down from the porch, mud splattering his pant cuffs, he turned back for one last look at the house. The porch light still on, the back door ajar. Somewhere in that rain, something didn't fit. He knew right away this wasn't a case of an adult walking away. On his way back to the car, he spotted a junior officer's flashlight beam probing around the fence. The two men met eyes. No words needed. No one had found any sign that Harold Whitman was still anywhere around here. All that remained was the heavy night, and those boot prints halting in the open ground, like a question mark, without an answer. As he pulled away from the yard, Lawson glanced through the window. Clara was still standing there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the lit porch. No tears, no questions, just silence. In his mind, a thought flashed and clung like barbed wire. Harold Whitman didn't disappear. Someone made him disappear from this place. The police car started up, rolling slowly along the flooded dirt road, its red lights flashing, reflected on the pitch-black lake surface. In the quiet night of rural Georgia, Harold Whitman's disappearance had just begun. But Lawson knew this feeling wasn't that of a missing person search. It carried the scent of a crime. Dawn hadn't fully broken when the sound of barking dogs echoed along the shore of Lake Tobsuff Key. At 5 a.m., thick fog blanketed the water, wisps of cold vapor rising to blur everything like frosted glass. Sheriff Lawson stood on the wet grass, hat gripped tightly, watching the Bibb County K-9 unit begin tracking. The handler's whistle pierced the air, then the two bloodhounds split off, noses nearly glued to the ground. The sense of nighttime rain, cigarette smoke, and human presence mixed in the heavy, humid air. The boot prints from the night before still faintly imprinted on the soft turf, leading straight toward the lake. Flashlights swept in long arcs, illuminating patches of sloppy mud. Lawson followed silently, eyes fixed on every small detail. Everyone sensed the unusual atmosphere, heavy, cloying, as if the lake's surface concealed something. The dogs halted at the water's edge, whining softly, circling before lifting their heads. They refused to go further. The trainer urged them on, but both stood frozen, noses pointed at the water, tails tucked. Lawson crouched, examining the ground closely. No sliding footprints, no drag marks, no dragged mud. If Harold had truly gone to the lake, he would have stepped down here, but the water lay flat, no ripples, nothing floating up. The dogs lost the scent right there, as if the human trail abruptly vanished. The sun began to rise, its first rays piercing the thick fog, glinting off the dew-slicked shore. A young officer called out loudly from the right, "Sheriff over here." Lawson hurried over. Beneath a small oak tree, not far from the lake shore, half buried in wet leaves, lay a dark brown fedora, its leather band darkened, thoroughly soaked. Nearby, in the mud, a glint of dull metal caught the light. Lawson bent down, picking up a copper lighter engraved with H.W. Harold Whitman, the only two items bearing clear traces of the missing man. The air around the lake shore seemed to thicken. Officers formed a search line through the area, probing every bush, every indented patch of earth, but found nothing more. Every direction dead-ended, as if the man had evaporated into the night. Lawson stood still, watching water drip from the hat in his palm, his gaze distant, certain these items couldn't have fallen naturally if Harold had just gone for a walk. Another call rang out from the path leading to the dirt road behind the Whitman house. An officer pointed down at the still soggy ground. There, two deep tire tracks were etched in, wheelbase nearly 10 feet, distinctive tread pattern of a 1956 Ford. A common model in Macon at the time, but not belonging to the Whitmans. Harold owned only a GMC work truck. Clara drove an old Plymouth. No one in the area reported taxis or visitors the night before, and the rain had been sufficient to ensure those tracks weren't from days prior. Lawson crouched, lightly touching a finger to the tire mark. The mud still soft. The vehicle had left less than a few hours ago. He scanned around, following the tracks, seeing them veer back toward the main road connecting to the highway. The dirt path had only one exit. If anyone had come here in the night, they had surely stopped right at this spot. And Harold, if taken away, had left the house by this route. The sun crept above the tree line, casting pale golden light on the distant damp rooftops. A crow's caw echoed from the forest edge, shattering the cloying atmosphere over the scene. Lawson stood silent, the cold lighter in his hand. He knew he was standing at the last place with traces of Harold Whitman, and these things, the hat, the lighter, the tire tracks, were telling the story of the night before. It was just that no one yet understood it all. When he returned to the house, Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick robe, eyes red-rimmed. Lawson asked about any strange vehicles around. She shook her head, insisting the evening had only the two of them in the house, no visitors. But in her voice lingered a faint hesitation, a slightly off breath, enough to make Lawson pause and observe longer than necessary. Inside, the kitchen retained its chilling neatness, the dining table empty, wooden floor dry, as if everything had been rearranged after the incident. Lawson looked around, the copper mug from last night, still sealed in an evidence bag. But the ginger liquor scent still faintly lingered somewhere, blending with the damp wood aroma. He stepped back out to the porch, eyes gliding over the trees, trembling in the early morning breeze. No one said more. An officer carried off the hat and lighter, wrapped in white cloth bags. Clara watched them go, hands clasped tightly, a flicker of unease in her eyes, quickly concealed. The morning wind gusted strong, rustling the curtains, sunlight flashing across her face, both fragile and vacant. Lawson paused at the steps, gazing toward the lake one last time. The fog hadn't fully lifted, the water mirror still. Beneath that haze, he sensed a different silence. Not the quiet of morning, but the silence of something buried too deep. In his mind, the image of boot prints halting in the grass, the hastily rinsed copper mug, and tire tracks belonging to no one, began overlapping into a shadowy picture. Harold Whitman had vanished, but Lawson understood no one disappears without leaving traces. The problem was, those traces were lying. The next afternoon, with the fog cleared and morning sun shining on the Whitman house roof, Sheriff Lawson returned. He came with 2 deputies, carrying an official search warrant. Clara opened the door, her demeanor unusually calm. She wore a gray dress, hair neatly done, eyes puffy and red but dry. The air in the house still carried the damp scent of the rainy night, and a faint ginger aroma lingering in the kitchen. Lawson said little. He instructed the deputies to recheck Harold's bedroom and study while he sat across from Clara in the living room. In the silence, the ticking clock became the only sound in the room. He asked, voice even. Not meeting her eyes directly, Mrs. Whitman, could you tell me about your marriage lately? Anything that might have stressed or upset him? Clara replied slowly, voice softening. He was depressed, work pressure lately. Some nights he couldn't sleep, talked strange things. I think he just needed rest. Lawson didn't react, just nodded slightly. But in his mind echoed neighbor Jensen's words. They argued about money. Meanwhile, the young deputy emerged from the study, holding an old notebook. In it, the last page bore a few scrawled lines. Chest hurts, need to see doctor. Clara says no need. The writing hasty, pen strokes heavy, as if carved. Lawson took it, his gaze darkening. He asked, did you know your husband had chest pain, or any health issues? Clara frowned slightly, then nodded. Yes, just mild pain. I bought painkillers for him. What kind? Not sure of the name. Some sedative, helps with sleep. That answer led to a more thorough search. In the bedroom, the nightstand drawer by Harold's side held an empty vial of morphine tablets, and beside it, a small glass bottle containing white powder, unlabeled, no instructions. Sunlight from the window hit the tabletop, making the bottle gleam with a cold white sheen. A deputy turned to Lawson, eyes conveying silent understanding. Lawson asked again, voice lower, more cautious, what is this medicine, Mrs. Whitman? Clara replied immediately, without hesitation, Harold's painkiller. Doctor prescribed it, he had chronic back pain. Which doctor? Dr. Hall's clinic, downtown Macon. That afternoon, Lawson drove himself to see Dr. Hall, the man who had monitored Harold's health for years. The elderly doctor shook his head right away upon hearing the drug name, morphine tablets. I never prescribed that for Mr. Whitman. And at that time, it was highly restricted, only available through hospitals. Lawson thanked him, but inside he knew the investigation's direction had shifted. He drove back, the afternoon light, stretching long shadows on the damp dirt road, tire hum, blending with his heavy thoughts. Morphine, no prescription, unlabeled white powder. When he returned to the Whitman house, he found Clara standing on the porch, gazing at the lake, her figure statue still. Lawson approached, stating curtly, I need to take a few things for testing. She nodded, asking nothing more. He bagged the bottle and morphine vial in white cloth, marking them meticulously before leaving the scene. Her every gesture remained composed, but that very composure chilled Lawson. That night, in the small office at the county headquarters, Lawson placed the bottle on the desk, watching the lamplight reflect off the white powder inside. He called the GBI lab in Atlanta for urgent analysis. They promised results in a few days. A mix of intuition and experience kept him from sleep. In the office silence, he gazed out the window, where faint moonlight fell on the newly opened case file. Whitman, Harold, missing persons, suspicious circumstances. 2 days later, the preliminary results arrived. The thin sheet of paper, a few typed lines short and to the point, but enough to make Lawson sit motionless for a long time. The white powder sample tested positive for barbiturates, a potent sedative, high doses capable of causing respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. Not morphine, not ordinary sleeping pills. A dangerous chemical used only in specialized medicine and impossible to obtain easily in Macon in 1958. Lawson folded the report, looking up at the scene map spread on the desk. The disparate details began fitting together. The husband with chest pain, wife claiming to buy medicine. The hastily rinsed copper mug with a metallic scent. Boot prints halting in the grass. Unfamiliar 1956 Ford tire tracks, and now the mystery bottle. When he confronted Clara again, she still maintained her softness, voice gentle, but this time Lawson no longer saw a woman panicked over a lost husband. Before him was someone trying to control every detail, every word, every glance, every breath. No direct evidence, but in Lawson's mind, suspicion had become conviction. He said nothing declarative, just stood, donned his hat, and murmured before leaving. "If there's anything you haven't told, you should say it soon. Everything comes back around, Mrs. Whitman, especially the truth." The door closed behind him, leaving the house steeped in late afternoon light, where a woman stood still, eyes directed toward the foggy lake. Out there, the police team continued searching, but for Lawson, the search was no longer for Harold Whitman. It was for what Clara Whitman was hiding. A week after the Atlanta lab sent the results, Sheriff Lawson returned to the small wooden house by the lake, with a clearer directive in mind. He was no longer searching for a missing man, but tracing a cleverly woven chain of lies beneath the facade of an ideal marriage. As the investigative team re-sifted Harold's study, they discovered a stuck drawer. Inside was a dark leather folder, edges frayed, carefully folded double. Lawson opened it, a life insurance policy, signed in February 1958, only 2 months before Harold vanished. The beneficiary field clearly stated, Clara Whitman, spouse. The policy amount, $50,000, a huge sum in Macon at the time. Lawson flipped to the last page, eyeing the signature, Harold Whitman. The writing slightly slanted, trembling and bolder than other documents of Harold's he'd seen. Pay stubs, construction contracts, licenses, something was off. He took a copy of the file to the insurance company office, downtown Macon. The branch manager, a man in round glasses, reviewed it and frowned slightly. "This signature, it's not the same as on Mr. Whitman's file from last year. Could be someone signed on his behalf." Lawson asked, "Was she present when the policy was taken out?" "Yes. Mrs. Whitman said her husband was ill, asked her to fill it out for him." The answer was as cold as metal. Lawson said no more, just thanked her and walked out. He knew that meant Clara not only had motive, but had prepared in advance. That afternoon, he went to the Bibb County Bank, rechecking the Whitmans' transaction ledger for the week. Harold disappeared. A $1,300 withdrawal appeared on the morning of April 17th, signed by hand, Clara Whitman. He requested the statement. The note line below it read clearly, paid a C.L. Brown. The name made Lawson pause. Who was Brown? A friend? A supplier? He asked the bank teller. The cashier recalled, "A woman, I think she worked at the old clinic on the west side of Macon, something like a nurse." Lawson jotted it down, immediately calling the clinic. The response he got was just a sigh. "Miss Brown quit, left town last week. No forwarding address." In his mind, the pieces began to fit. A mystery bottle, an irregular insurance policy, a cash transaction to a vanished nurse, signs of a meticulously planned scheme, and Clara at the center. When he confronted her again, Clara seemed to have regained complete composure. Her voice was soft, almost persuasive. "Harold didn't have time, I just filled out the form for him. And that check, it was for an acquaintance. She helped care for my mother a while back." No emotion, no hesitation. Just a perfect explanation, prepared in advance. Lawson didn't argue, just silently watched her. In that gaze was something that made Clara turn away, step toward the window, where Lake Tobsofsky reflected the faint light of late afternoon. A few days later, the first newspapers began running the story. The Macon Telegraph ran the headline, "Contractor Vanishes, Wife Holds the Answers." Black and white photos of Harold and Clara appeared on the front page. Neighbors whispered on the street. Those who once praised them as the ideal couple now gossiped in hushed tones as Clara passed by. No one knew the truth, but everyone sensed the smell of something wrong. Lawson, amid the press pressure, still tried to stay silent. He had no concrete evidence to charge anyone, just disparate details, each a little piece, like shards of broken glass from a mirror, reflecting what no one wanted to see. He continued searching for C.L. Brown, contacting hospitals and clinics around Macon, but the name seemed to have vanished from the map along with Harold. By the end of May, the official body search concluded. Lake Tobsofsky was dragged twice, the woods around the Whitman house combed again with canine units, but nothing turned up. No body, no witnesses, no confession. The investigators had to temporarily close the file with a single note: suspicious disappearance, unresolved. That night, Lawson sat alone in his office, the desk lamp casting light on his weary face. Beside him was the HW engraved lighter and the crumpled insurance file. He knew the case wasn't over. It was just waiting, like the still lake out there, where everything seemed peaceful, but beneath the deep water, something remained unsaid. Summer 1959, the Harold Whitman disappearance file was moved to the administratively closed section. No body, no official suspect, no evidence strong enough for prosecution. After more than a year of lake searches, interrogations, lab tests, and waiting, the Bibb County Court declared Harold legally missing. In the brief court hearing, Clara sat alone in the front row, wearing a black dress, holding a white handkerchief. When the judge banged the gavel confirming the presumed deceased status, she didn't shed a tear. A month later, the insurance company wired the payout, $50,000, into an account in Clara Whitman's name. She quickly sold Harold's truck, liquidated all his construction tools, then left Macon without a goodbye. Folks said she moved up to Atlanta, opened a small shop, then remarried a few years later. To the community around Lake Tobsofsky, the name Whitman gradually sank down with the cold mud at the lake bottom. Sheriff Lawson, who had spent many sleepless nights on that case, was transferred to another area not long after. Before leaving, he personally sealed all the evidence: the copper mug, a copy of the insurance policy, the $1,300 check made out to C.L. Brown, along with the entire investigation report, all packed into a small oak box, labeled Case Hash 580417, Whitman Harold. He wrote the final line on the file cover: "Insufficient evidence, suspicion remains." The 1970s passed, and the Whitman house by the lake fell into decay. Roof tiles sagged in patches. The back door, where Harold had stepped out for the last time, hung only by rusted hinges. Weeds grew knee-high, covering the porch. Occasionally, local kids retold the story of the house where the man vanished, like an old Macon legend. No one mentioned Clara anymore, and Lake Tobsofsky remained silent, shimmering in summer, fog-shrouded in winter. By the early 1980s, the Bibb County evidence storage was relocated. Old file boxes gathered dust in the new warehouse, where high temperatures yellowed the papers, fading signatures and ink stamps. The Whitman box sat on the third shelf of the eighth row of metal racks, wedged between hundreds of other unsolved cases. No one opened it for decades. In 1990, Ed Lawson died at age 78. In his effects, they found an old notebook, the last page bearing a short sentence: "If he didn't walk away, someone helped him disappear." No one knew how long he still thought about that case before closing his eyes. But for him, the truth had never rested. Then time continued to flow on, like the lake's flat surface after a stone's throw, until 2003, when the state of Georgia established the GBI Cold Case Unit, a team dedicated to reviewing stalled unsolved cases. Thousands of files were reopened, old evidence boxes shipped for re-examination with new technology. In that long list, a name barely legible on a faded label suddenly caught the eye of a young detective. Case hash 580417, Whitman Herald. Inside the box, the old wood scent and dampness of time still lingered. The tarnished copper mug, the $1,300 check, and the aged insurance file, all still there, as if waiting for someone to lift the lid on the memory chest and retell the story that Macon had forgotten half a century before. And when the file box was placed on the table in the GBI's modern lab in Atlanta, white light shining down on the thin dust layer coating the metal surface, time seemed to pause for a moment. The disappearance of Harold Whitman, thought buried forever under the 1958 mud, was about to be called by name again. In the list of hundreds of backlog files that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation began reviewing in 2003, case hash 580417, Whitman Herald barely caught anyone's attention. A disappearance from half a century ago, no body, no suspect, just a few yellowed papers and mundane evidence items. But Detective Laura Darnell, head of the GBI cold case team, lingered longer on the old label taped to the box side. Beneath the thick dust, she read the short handwritten note by Sheriff Ed Lawson, suspicious, no closure. Darnell was used to no-body cases. She believed truth never vanishes. It just waits for someone patient enough to piece together the fragments. When she opened that oak box, the musty scent of years poured out, along with a chill from the old metal. Inside, evidence bags sealed with yellowed twine, a copper mug, the insurance contract, a $1,300 check, and a typed report bundle from Sheriff Lawson. At the top of the report was the heading, The Disappearance of Harold Whitman, April 1958. Darnell read through the afternoon that day. Lawson's account in the file was simple but clear. Boot prints halting in the grass, copper mug with metallic scent. Insurance policy signed February 1958. Beneficiary, Clara Whitman. She underlined 3 lines, circled the phrase, beneficiary. With her experience in financial crime investigations, she knew that in many spousal homicides, money was always the start of the story. The next day, Darnell took the insurance contract to the GBI document analysis room. The technician placed 2 Harold Whitman signature samples under the glass table, illuminated by ultraviolet light. The pen strokes in the insurance policy were heavy, jagged, and uneven. A man's hand trembling or someone else trying to imitate. Compared to Harold's signature on a 1957 building permit, the slant and emphasis were completely different. The forensic examiner's conclusion was brief. Deliberate forgery. Darnell leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. 50 years ago, technology wasn't advanced enough for Lawson to prove this, but now everything was clear as day. If the signature was forged, the sole beneficiary was Clara Whitman, the wife who left Macon right after collecting the insurance money. That evening, she pulled the photocopy of the $1,300 check from the same evidence box. The ink had blurred, the paper yellowed, but the line was still legible. Pay to the order of C.L. Brown. No note, no payment reason. Darnell accessed the archived Bibb County bank records via the electronic database system, querying the 1958 transaction ledger. The results showed the transaction occurred right on the morning Harold disappeared. She paused a long time before the $1,300 figure, a large sum in that era's context, enough to buy a new Ford car. A wife who just signed an insurance policy, also withdrawing cash for a woman not in the family financial records, that couldn't be mere coincidence. The name C.L. Brown was entered into the National Resident Database. A few hours later, the computer displayed results. Catherine L. Brown, born 1929, retired nurse, currently residing in Gainesville, Florida. Darnell sat up straight. After nearly half a century, one of the 2 remaining names in the Whitman case was still alive. She printed the file, closed the evidence box, then looked out the office window. Atlanta's sky that night was overcast, light rain streaking long trails on the glass. In the rain's sound, Darnell seemed to hear Lawson's low voice echoing from the old report. copper mug with metallic scent. She understood that what he sensed in 1958, though unprovable then, could now be answered with current technology. The next morning, Darnell headed to Florida. She drove 7 hours, Interstate 75, stretching endlessly through pine forests and pastures. In her mind, she kept stringing together the facts: forged signature, withdrawal to a nurse, mystery bottle, and husband vanished without trace. A clear logical chain formed: forgery plus drug purchase plus disappearance = poisoning. When her car turned into the small Gainesville suburb, the sun was nearly setting. On the steps of a blue house, a silver-haired woman was watering flowers, walking slowly. Darnell stopped, pulling the old photo from the file, a 1958 shot of C.L. Brown as an operating room nurse. Though the face was deeply wrinkled now, those eyes, that chin, were unmistakable. After 46 years, one link in the Harold Whitman disappearance chain had survived time. And Darnell knew, if this woman still remembered, the truth, though buried in time's dust, could still be awakened. The morning in Gainesville was serene and lightly sunny, golden light filtering through moss-draped oak branches. Detective Laura Darnell parked in front of the small wooden house at the end of Maple Avenue, where a faded C.L. Brown, R.N. retired, sign still hung on the fence. The 74-year-old woman opened the door, her frame thin but still carrying the quick alertness of a nurse used to hospital shifts. She eyed the GBI badge in Darnell's hand, silent for a few seconds, then nodded slightly, inviting her in. No need for much small talk. Darnell started with the yellowed paper envelope, placing it on the old wooden table. Inside was a photocopy of the $1,300 check, now discolored. In the upper right corner, the handwriting stood out. Pay to the order of C.L. Brown. Do you recognize this signature? Darnell asked, voice slow and even. Brown stared at the paper for a long time. She took a soft breath, then nodded. I know it. I cashed this check. It's been so many years, I thought no one remembered anymore. Without pressing, the elderly woman's words poured out slowly, haltingly, as if still haunted by something. In 1958, Brown was an assistant nurse at Dr. Hall's private clinic, where Clara Whitman occasionally stopped by for medications. One early February morning, Clara came to see her, dressed neatly, voice gentle, asking if she could buy some strong painkillers for my husband with chronic back pain. She said Harold didn't want to see a doctor, just needs sleeping pills and painkillers to get through a few days. Brown hesitated. Back then, selling controlled drugs without a prescription was against the rules. But Clara brought cash, was persuasive, and most importantly, seemed to know exactly what she wanted. She handed me a note with the drug name. No script, just written, morphine compound, keep sealed. She paused, glancing at Darnell, then added, at the time I thought she had family in medicine, so she knew how to use it. I resold her a few doses, didn't think further. 2 months later, Clara returned. This time, she said, the previous dose wasn't strong enough, need something more potent. When Brown said morphine tablets were under strict control, Clara pulled a check from her purse. She said she'd pay double if I could get liquid form, the kind used for cancer patients. Brown took the check, the very one now before her, and promised to ask an acquaintance who worked in a pharma lab. I didn't know what I was doing, she said softly, voice catching. At the time, they were starting trials on a new drug called fentanyl. No one knew its full effects yet, just that it was very strong, used for surgical anesthesia. A technician friend could get a bit. I agreed to help. 3 days later, Brown handed Clara a small vial, label faded, containing a few milligrams of pure white powder. Clara only asked how to dissolve it, not the dosage. I remember clearly, because she asked, what does it taste like? I said it has no taste, just a bit bitter. She smiled and said, good. After that, Brown never saw Clara again. A week passed, then 2. One April morning, she read the Macon Telegraph and saw the headline, Contractor vanishes, wife holds the answers. Clara's photo was right on the front page, black eyes staring into the lens, cold and empty. Brown recounted how her hands shook so badly the paper fell to the floor. I knew right away what I'd done, or at least, what I'd enabled. She folded the check, hid it in a small metal box, and stayed silent for 46 years. No one asked, so she didn't tell. I thought I'd be guilty if I spoke, since I'd broken the law selling drugs too. But the longer it went, the heavier it weighed. Some nights I dreamed she came back, holding the vial, smiling. Her voice trembled slightly as she reached that part. Darnell stayed silent, just listening, not taking notes. When Brown paused, she asked softly, "Do you still have any proof?" The elderly woman nodded, left the table, stepped into the back room. A moment later, she returned with the small metal box, lock rusted. Inside was a photocopy of the check, still pressed in plastic, the Clara Whitman signature clear, pen strokes confident, not a tremor. Darnell carefully took it, gloved up, placed it in a new evidence bag. As she stood to say goodbye, Brown only said one thing softly, "I kept it to remind myself that silence can be a sin too." That afternoon, Darnell returned to Atlanta. She handed over the statement to the forensics lab. The experts analyzed the drug details Brown described. The preliminary results surprised the whole team. The description matched pure fentanyl perfectly, a synthetic compound experimentally developed in Belgium in the late 1950s, with only very limited samples brought to the U.S. for research purposes. An internal report was drafted that very night. High likelihood victim was poisoned with fentanyl, a substance with toxicity dozens of times that of morphine. Incident occurred before commercialization, indicating the purchaser had special access. Laura Darnell read to the last line, sitting motionless for a long time in her office. Outside the window, Atlanta city lights sparkled, traffic flowing smoothly like the breath of a new era. But in her mind, images from 1958 sharpened rainy night in Macon, the copper mug hastily rinsed in the sink, the suspiciously calm wife, and the unlabeled vial of white powder. A new link had been pulled from the past. And for the first time in nearly half a century, Sheriff Lawson's old question, "Who made Harold Whitman disappear?" had a direction for an answer. In the GBI forensics lab in downtown Atlanta, fluorescent white lights cast down on spotless steel tabletops. Every tool gleamed orderly, cold as a chapel of truth. That morning, Detective Laura Darnell stood behind the observation glass, arms crossed, watching the technicians prepare to unseal the most crucial piece of Whitman evidence, the Moscow Mule copper mug. The old copper mug was removed from oak box hash 580417. The 1958 yellow label nearly detached from the metal surface. The seal remained intact, twine wrapped tight, faint traces of Sheriff Lawson's wax seal showing the Bibb County imprint. 46 years, untouched by anyone. Time had tarnished the copper, giving the surface a dark gray patina, but it held its shape, the silent evidence of a distant rainy night. The chief forensic pathologist, Dr. Garvey, gloved up, cut the seal twine with a scalpel. The room fell silent. Only the steady hum of the air conditioner and faint clink of metal on glass tray. The mug was placed on the scale, then moved to the sample prep table. "We'll swab the surface and extract residues," he said. Voice even, careful as if handling an antique. Clear solvent drops were pipetted onto the rim, gently swabbed with sterile cotton. The sample went into a glass vial, sealed, then loaded into the GCMS system, gas chromatography mass spectrometry. The massive machine hummed low, display lights flickering, vapor molecules separated, scanned through the column, then appeared gradually on the screen, like a strange chemical symphony. Darnell stood motionless, eyes fixed on the signal peaks. Each spike was a compound, ethanol, citric acid, copper, and then a small trace, almost negligible, buried among faint signals. The technician zoomed in. The mass spec read out 336.4. Garvey looked up, eyes lighting behind his glasses. "That's fentanyl." The room held its breath another beat. Next, the automated system flagged another signal, smaller, at 285.3, morphine. Garvey jotted quickly on the board, fentanyl, morphine, trace levels. Then he looked up, said softly, "These two substances never appear together in a normal drink. Are you sure the wife mentioned painkillers?" Darnell nodded slightly. In her mind, Brown's indirect confession immediately resurfaced. "I gave her the white powder form, no taste." The drug handover time, April 1958, only days before Harold vanished. Everything fit together chillingly. That afternoon, the forensics team conducted a full chain of custody review. Each seal layer, each time stamp, cross-checked against Bibb County records. 1958. Lawson initial seal. 1975. County storage transfer. 1990. Relocation to GBI warehouse. 2003. Transfer to Atlanta cold case unit. No tiers, no label changes, no unauthorized openings. The chain of custody complete, absolutely legally sound. To the law, that meant this evidence still held value after 46 years. Darnell sat in her small office, light from the window spilling across the desk, cluttered with files. Before her were two reports, C.L. Brown's statement and the GCMS analysis results. When placed side by side, every point connected perfectly. February and April 1958. Brown sold drugs to Clara. Drug type: white powder form, no taste. Chemical results: trace fentanyl. Morphine traces reinforced the possibility of a mixture or amateur compounding. In the summary report sent to the GBI director, the conclusion line, short but heavy as a verdict. Evidence hash 580417 shows traces of fentanyl and morphine. Valid chain of custody. Likelihood that victim Harold Whitman was poisoned via Moscow Mule drink nearly certain. Darnell signed below that line, blue ink soaking slowly into the paper. Outside the window, Atlanta skies drizzled lightly, a thin November rain like mist, making her briefly recall Lake Tobsofki on the rainy night of 1958. Only now, that fog had lifted. That evening, as she left headquarters, the fresh ink report was emailed to the Georgia State Prosecutor's office. On Interstate 75, car lights stretched into long streaks. In Darnell's mind, Lawson's words from the old report echoed again. Copper mug with metallic scent. He had been right. It was just that his world lacked the tools to hear it speak. Now 46 years later, that very mug had spoken. And it told not just of a disappearance, but of a murder covered up with silence, cunning, and time. In the GBI crime scene lab, blue light from the screen illuminated Detective Laura Darnell's tense face. On the screen before her was a three-dimensional simulation of the Whitman house, reconstructed from 1958 sketches, Sheriff Lawson's old statements, and archived weather logs from the Georgia Meteorological Service. The two-story wooden house appeared in virtual space, low-sloped roof, back door overlooking the porch, steps leading down to the grass where the boot prints halted midway. The simulation's background audio played pattering rain, wind rustling through pines, just like the night Harold vanished. Darnell observed, rotating the view, zooming in on the kitchen, where the copper mug was found. Copper mug, high-dose fentanyl, no taste. Harold drank around 11:15, she murmured, almost to herself. On the model, she marked the timeline, setting the porch light to flicker at 11:50 p.m. The time Clara said she could still see her husband through the glass. From the forensics lab's toxicology data, GBI calculated the average lethality time for an equivalent fentanyl dose, 20-30 minutes post-ingestion. If Harold finished drinking and stepped out to smoke, the cardiac arrest window could fall between 11:40 and 11:50 p.m., perfectly matching the neighbor's statement of hearing a door slam around then. On the screen, Darnell added a motion simulation layer, Harold leaving the dining table, mug in hand, heading to the porch. Porch light, casting a seated shadow, lighting a cigarette. In the inner kitchen corner, the model showed Clara at the sink, rinsing the remaining mug. Within half an hour, the victim would show respiratory distress signs, dizziness, then collapse. The cigarette glow fading, aligning with Clara's light vanished at 12:30, though he may have been dead long before. Darnell rotated the view, opening the body disposal motion simulation. From statements and scene sketches, she reconstructed the likely path, porch door, backyard, trail, nearby construction site. Per old records, Harold had just bought the Tobes of Key hillside lot to build a new mansion, just over a mile from his current home. There, concrete footings were half poured, soil still soft. An ideal spot to hide something on a rainy night without being seen. She paused the simulation at 1 a.m. Clara called police, calm to an eerie degree. No struggle signs, no blood, no screams. Every detail pointed to one scenario. Harold Whitman died within 30 minutes of drinking the fentanyl-laced Moscow Mule. The body was removed before heavier rain, likely buried or concreted at the under-construction Tobes of Key site. Darnell presented the reconstruction report to the GBI director that afternoon. The report wasn't long, just timelines, images, and evidence analysis excerpts. But on the final page, she added a short note. If the perpetrator wanted to stage a disappearance, a rainy night was perfect. Water-washed traces, wind-masked sounds, all passed in silence. And if someone had a ready construction site with open concrete footings, that was no coincidence. Darnell sat still, watching the model rotate slowly on the screen. Blue data points blinked like souls of forgotten facts. She zoomed on the backyard area, remeasuring from porch to lake edge, then overlaid 1958 topographic maps on current satellite imagery. The old trail was gone, but Harold's intended mansion site was now a small woods, dense trees around the remaining concrete footings. There, she whispered. That evening, Darnell held an emergency meeting with the investigative team. They discussed excavating the Tobes of Key site. A forensics expert said, "After all these years, if the body was truly buried under concrete, bones would retain calcium structure. We can detect with ground-penetrating radar." Another added, "Need a court order. That land's private property now." Darnell nodded. She knew getting approval would take time, but this was the only chance after nearly half a century. She drafted the warrant application that night, citing the evidence analysis report and Brown witness statement as grounds for excavation. On the screen, the 3D Whitman house model still glowed. Simulated rain streaks falling on the porch roof synced to the original 1958 audio log. She turned off the lights, leaving only the screen's faint blue glow. In the quiet space, wind through the window carried a sound like rain. For a fleeting moment, Darnell felt like she was standing on the 1958 porch, where yellow light spilled onto wet wood and a man had just vanished. As she left the office, she paused, eyeing the old photo pinned to the bulletin board. Harold Whitman's gentle smile in a suit. Below it, Lawson's handwritten note from back then. "Find the truth, no matter how long it takes." 46 years had passed, and now, the truth was rising to the surface, literally. Darnell closed the file folder, left the room. Tomorrow, she'd stand amid the Tobes of Key site, where rain once fell, and order the dig where Macon had forgotten. Late November morning, 2004, thick fog blanketed Lake Tobes of Key shore. The dirt road into the lot Harold Whitman chose for his dream home was now an overgrown trail. Crumbling old concrete slabs, green moss everywhere, half-collapsed wooden frames, all remnants of a dream rotted by time. Detective Laura Darnell stood amid the damp ground, cold wind whipping her face. Beside her, the GBI forensics team prepped ground-penetrating radar, GPR equipment, a machine that could see through concrete to detect anomalies. This was step one in the excavation plan she'd proposed, and just gotten Bibb County Court approval for 3 days prior. As the machine powered up, its hum blended with rustling leaves. The screen showed gray response waves, each ripple a soil layer, object, or void. Darnell watched the data scroll slowly. Per meter passed, the radar beeped steadily. On the fourth scan, the signal spiked sharply. On screen, a dark area appeared, oval-shaped, buried about 1.5 meters under the concrete footing. "There's a void down there," the technician whispered. Everyone's pulses quickening. The team marked the spot, chalking a white outline, then drilled a small test hole. The aged concrete cracked easily, fragments pattering down. A whiff of long-buried damp earth rose, pungent and cold. By afternoon, drilling past a meter deep, the technician's shovel hit something harder than soil. He crouched, brushing fine dust, then froze. A bone fragment, ivory white, protruded from dark earth. All sound seemed to halt. Darnell approached, knelt, eyes fixed on the shape. Long bone end, slender, with an old break in the middle. She knew she was seeing a piece of truth, buried 46 years. As digging continued, more bone fragments emerged, scattered haphazardly, as if tossed in haste. A black shirt button mixed in clay, a snapped watchband piece, and right under concrete chunks, a rusted wristwatch pulled from the pit. On its dull gray metal face, sunset light faintly reflected 3 hand-engraved initials. H.W. Darnell gripped the watch, gloved hand trembling slightly. No doubt now, the man down there was Harold Whitman. But per protocol, she signaled the forensics techs to continue. Photos, measurements, bone and evidence collection. By evening, as the pit widened, the middle-aged man's skeleton emerged fully. Left rib fractures, skewed spine, indicating impact before or during burial. Darnell stood silent, gazing down, saying nothing. The generator hum, falling dirt, and breaths around her were the only sounds. She felt like Lawson himself, who stood here nearly half a century ago, was watching. The remains were carefully collected, sealed, and transported to the Atlanta Forensics Lab. 2 weeks later, DNA results arrived on Darnell's desk. The comparison sample from David Whitman, Harold's eldest son, now over 60. The result line bold, clear, unmistakable. Bone sample matches David Whitman's DNA. 99.99% kinship probability. Darnell set the result down, eyes closing. 60 years, generations of police passing, files nearly rotting away. And now, finally, the 1958 missing man had a name again. No longer just a presumed victim. She called his son, voice low, steadying herself. "We've found your father, David, where he planned to build his new home. We'll bring him back." Long silence on the line. Then just a choked breath from a man who'd lived a lifetime with an unanswered question. That afternoon, GBI issued an internal bulletin, case #580417, remains identified. 46 years later, Harold Whitman's remains had been found, with irrefutable evidence, the watch engraved with his initials, fractured bones, and shirt button from the suit he wore that rainy night. Standing on the Tobes of Key site one last time, Darnell watched sunset settle over the freshly excavated concrete. The distant lake reflected brilliant orange light. Cold gusts through the pines carried damp earth scent and lapping waves. She knew the case wasn't closed, just opening a new chapter. But at least, after nearly half a century, that man was no longer forgotten. And somewhere, in the earth's silence, Harold Whitman had finally been found. The GBI office lights burned late. On Laura Darnell's desk, old paper files lay splayed, yellowed pages, frayed edges. After confirming Harold Whitman's remains, she knew she couldn't stop there. The key question remained unanswered. Why and how? She began digging through archived medical records in Macon's old hospital vault, where 1950s patients were treated. It took nearly 2 weeks with an elderly archivist to find the rotted, ink-smeared box. Whitman Harold Admissions, 1956, 1958. Inside, 3 typed admission forms on Underwood typewriter paper, faded ink but still readable. The first page, dated September 1956, Harold Whitman admitted to ER with mild respiratory distress, convulsions, vomiting. Treating physician noted, morphine poisoning, cause undetermined. At the time, his wife brought him in. In the home medication section, the doctor added a short note. Wife states, patient mistook mother's painkillers. File closed after 3 days treatment. Patient fully recovered. The second sheet, January 1958, described a similar incident. Harold admitted overnight with unusual drowsiness, weak pulse, shortness of breath. This time, diagnosis recurrent morphine exposure. Doctor added a brief annotation, recommend removing opioid-containing medications from household cabinet. Darnell sat motionless a long time, finger lightly tracing the two sheets. Just 2 months after the second admission, Harold Whitman vanished. She looked up at the whiteboard on the wall, where she'd pinned dozens of scribbled notes. Amid the scrawls stood out 3 timeline markers. 1956, morphine poisoning #1, recovered. 1958, Jan morphine poisoning #2, recovered. 1958, Ia Pert, drank Moscow Mule, fatal. All 3 incidents in the same house, same repeating pattern, identical symptoms. Clara, as the ER transporter. No doubt now, this wasn't accident. This was a deliberate testing sequence. She forwarded the files to the toxicology team. They analyzed morphine presence in Harold's system from the 2 admissions. The results silenced the group, low doses, enough for poisoning but not death, like someone testing thresholds. The third time, with pure fentanyl, just a fraction sufficed to end life. She learned from her own 2 failures, the toxicologist noted. Started with morphine, easy to control, easy to explain. When it didn't work, she sought stronger. Calculated, progressive behavior. This wasn't a crime of passion. Darnell nodded. She recalled Brown's words. She asked the drug's taste. No one asks that without intent to administer to another. That night, she wrote the report for the Georgia state prosecutor. In the summary, she noted, medical records prove a poisoning pattern spanning 1956. 1958. Perpetrator showed dosing experimentation, reaction monitoring, then escalation and substance change. This is a systematic behavioral model, not impulsive action. Case fits classic poison pattern case profile. The next day, lead prosecutor Mark Leland came personally to the GBI office to review all evidence. He skimmed the files, pausing at the morphine poisoning 1956 page. A cold smile flickered at his lip. You know, Darnell, this is what juries grasp easiest. She didn't kill her husband in anger. She researched how to kill her husband. That evening, with office lights off, Darnell sat alone. On her desk, the 3 old hospital sheets lay neatly beside Harold's black and white photo. In it he stood at a job site, gentle smile, hands lime-dusted. Behind him, Clara present, gaze angled at the lens, unreadable as affectionate or icy. She closed her eyes, trying to envision April 17, 1958 night. That man, stepping onto the porch, ginger drink in hand, unaware it held the 3rd dose, the final one. Twice before, he'd survived. This time, no. Opening her eyes, Darnell eyed the large note on the board, Lawson's handwritten line from back then, insufficient evidence, suspicion remains. She smiled sadly. Now Lawson had his answer. The Harold Whitman case was no longer a disappearance. It was a story of methodical serial crime, a plan repeated until perfected, and the woman behind it, Clara Whitman, had turned what seemed like love, care, and small pills into tools of death. Monday morning, September 12, 2005, Atlanta skies gray and overcast. After nearly a year of investigation, hundreds of hours sifting files, toxicology analysis, witness interviews, and site excavation, Detective Laura Darnell placed on the Georgia State Prosecutor's desk a nearly 300-page report, compiling every scrap of evidence she and the cold case team had traced back from 1958's fragments. In the small GBI conference room, no one spoke for the first 10 minutes. On the projector screen, Darnell presented each section in turn. Toxicology evidence, Moscow Mule mug containing traces of fentanyl and morphine, legally sealed. Witness, statement from Catherine L. Brown confirming 2 sales of strong painkillers to Clara Whitman, February and April 1958. Financial, bank records proving a $1,300 withdrawal on the day of disappearance, forged signature on insurance policy, remains skeleton, exhumed at Tobzoff Key site, DNA confirmed matching victim's son. Pattern of behavior, Macon hospital records proving 2 prior poisonings, forming a poison pattern chain. All sections presented neatly, logically, like needles stitching tightly together, leaving no gaps. When the final slide appeared, the photo of the rusted watch engraved HW, the room fell silent. Lead prosecutor, Mark Leland, closed the file folder, looked up at Darnell. "Are you sure she's still alive?" "Yes, sir. Clara Whitman, now living in Utah under her second married name, Clara Whitman Durham. She's 80, still healthy, owns 2 properties, and receives pension from her deceased second husband." "And financial evidence?" "We've verified. The 1959 insurance payout went into her separate account. All subsequent accrued interest remains intact." Leland leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment, then said softly, "Good. Give me a draft arrest warrant." That afternoon, the emergency arrest warrant was sent to Bibb County Court. 3 judges reviewed and signed. The red stamp on the thin white paper issued a dry thud, ending nearly half a century of silence. The bold text at the top of the document, State of Georgia v. Clara Whitman, charge, first-degree murder, premeditated poisoning. Darnell held the warrant in her hand, saying nothing. She felt its weight, not just legal, but a belated closure for a life. 3 days later, she coordinated with the Salt Lake FBI field office for the arrest. Clara was located in the Ogden, Utah suburbs, in a single-story light-colored house with a small front garden. When agents arrived, she was sitting on a wooden chair on the porch, wearing a gray cardigan, reading the newspaper. "Mrs. Clara Whitman Durham?" the lead agent asked. She looked up, eyes still sharp, showing no surprise. When hearing the next sentence, the agent's voice steady. "By order of the Georgia State Court, you are under arrest for first-degree murder in connection with the death of your former husband Harold Whitman on April 17, 1958. No reaction, no questions. She just set the newspaper down, adjusted her collar, then extended both hands forward. The only word she uttered, soft and calm, "I need to take my heart medication." As the police car left Ogden, a neighbor, an elderly woman her age, stood at the fence, calling out, "What's going on?" An officer replied softly, "They say she was arrested for killing her husband in 1958. The neighbor gave an awkward laugh, shaking her head. "No way, Mrs. Clara's so kind, brings me cookies every week." At the temporary detention center in Salt Lake, Darnell was allowed to witness the first arraignment reading. The holding room cold and overly bright, the elderly woman sat still on the metal chair, back straight, eyes forward. As the prosecutor read the charges, his voice even in the room, defendant Clara Whitman, now Clara Durham, is charged with first-degree murder, using the poison fentanyl to cause the death of her husband, Harold Whitman, in 1958. Evidence includes physical items, witnesses, and the victim's remains identified in 2004. Not a single frown, no reaction. When asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Clara just looked straight ahead, cloudy eyes, and said slowly, clearly, "No." Outside the courthouse, TV cameras flashed non-stop. On the evening news, major networks ran the headline simultaneously. 46 years later, wife arrested in 1958, Georgia poison murder. And in the GBI office in Atlanta, Darnell stood silently by the window, watching rain fall on the street. The investigation was over, but the feeling wasn't victory, but a profound silence, like Lake Tobsofki, in memory. The 80-year-old woman might not live long enough for trial, but at least, justice had finally found its way back. The Salt Lake Police interrogation room was brightly cold and silent enough to hear the faint roll of a pen on the table. Clara Whitman sat there, hands clasped, cardigan collar pulled high covering half her chin. Before her was an untouched glass of water, and the one-way mirror opposite reflected the shadow of an 80-year-old woman, now called the 1958 murder perpetrator. For the first 6 hours, she said not a word. Every question from the investigators, about Harold, about the rainy night, about the vial, about the Tobsofki site, received only an empty stare. Darnell, permitted to attend the interrogation directly, didn't press. She just sat still, watching the stubborn silver-haired woman like an old rock, knowing that no matter how much erosion, the core inside remained unexposed. By mid-afternoon, light outside the window glass faded. A final ray of sun pierced through the curtain gap, shining on the metal table. Clara raised a hand to shield her eyes, sighed very softly, the first sound after 6 hours of silence. Then, as if some string inside finally snapped, she burst into tears. I just wanted him to stop yelling, her voice hoarse, words breaking. He kept saying over and over, every day. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought if he could sleep one peaceful night, things would get better. No one in the room moved. Darnell leaned forward slightly, her voice low and even. What did you give him, Clara? She bowed her head, hands trembling. Not poison, just a sedative. Catherine said a little would help him sleep deeper. I mixed it in the Moscow Mule, then he went out to the porch. Darnell stayed silent. In her mind, the 3D simulation of the rainy night sharpened, Harold stepping onto the porch, sitting down, and the cigarette glow fading. Then what happened after that? Clara didn't look up. When I went to check, he wasn't breathing. I panicked. I tried shaking him, calling, but nothing. I was afraid people would think I killed him. I thought, if no one knew, I could go on living. The final sentence dropped into the room like a heavy stone. 60 years of lies condensed into one. After a few hours' break, Clara agreed to write a statement. Darnell stood outside, watching through the glass as she held the trembling pen. The elderly handwriting shaky but clear, each word like carved with a dull blade. I gave him something to calm down. I never meant to kill him. When I saw him cold, I panicked. I buried him under the foundation to keep him close. I never meant to kill him. At the bottom, she signed Clara Whitman, the stroke weak, but with the same slant, as identical as the forged signature on the 1958 insurance policy. 2 days later, when questioned for details again, Clara provided specifics. The land west of the lake where Harold planned to build the house. There was a half-poured concrete footing. I asked 2 old workers to report it the next day. They didn't know anything. That statement, ironically, matched exactly the GPR team's discovery site 3 weeks prior. When the official confession was recorded and sealed, Darnell entered the room one last time. The elderly woman had calmed, sitting straight, eyes red but dry. Darnell placed the tarnished Moscow Mule mug on the table, the real evidence, sealed in plastic. She opened the bag, set the mug out, light reflecting off the flaking copper. You know, Darnell said softly. It stayed silent for 46 years. We had to use machines to make it speak about what you put in it. But in the end, you spoke for it. Clara looked at the mug for a long time, a flicker of sadness in her eyes, but no regret. I thought if I buried him there, he'd still be close to me. I was wrong, Darnell didn't reply. She collected the evidence, stood up. As the door closed, the hinge sounded softly in the cold space. Inside, Clara still sat still, eyes directed at the empty space ahead, where only images remained of a long-ago rainy night, porch light, and fading cigarette glow. The confession was sent that very night to the GBI office. And the first page, bold text, Statement of Clara Whitman, recorded and signed, September 16, 2004. At the bottom, beside her frail signature, Darnell noted in blue pen, finally she spoke in words for the copper mug. She closed the file, sat silent for a long time. Outside the detention center window, rain began to fall. The sound of drops on the tin roof blended with a faint metallic ring from the copper mug, like a belated confession, echoing between centuries. On November 25, 2004, Bibb County Courthouse became the focal point of statewide media in Georgia. In courtroom 2, the air was thick enough to hear the reporter's pen scratching. At the podium, lead prosecutor Mark Leland stood tall, voice steady through the microphone, as he read the over 40-page indictment, the result of a 46-year investigation. The special grand jury, 12 members, listened in silence as he read the opening lines. The state of Georgia indicts defendant Clara Whitman, also known as Clara Durham, on the charge of first-degree murder by poisoning, committed around April 17, 1958, against her husband Harold Whitman, through administration of the lethal substance fentanyl. Below, Detective Laura Darnell, the one who reopened the case, stood still, eyes on the large screen where evidence was presented item by item. The 1958 story, threaded together by irrefutable proofs. The first group was witnesses. Catherine L. Brown, retired nurse, admitted selling Clara 2 batches of strong painkillers, February and April 1958, right when Harold was hospitalized twice for morphine poisoning, and before he vanished. Her statement was recorded, signed, with a photocopy of the $1,300 check bearing Clara's signature. She said it was for her husband's back pain. Brown recounted in the deposition, then asked if the drug had a taste. I said no taste, and she smiled. The courtroom fell silent. A smile after nearly half a century still sent chills through listeners. Next was physical evidence. The Moscow Mule mug, sealed since 1958, opened in the Atlanta Forensics Lab, GCMS tested, revealing trace fentanyl and morphine matching the witness statement. The HW engraved watch, found with the remains under the concrete, confirmed as Harold's. Those remains, exhumed at the Tobsov key site, DNA matched to the victim's son. Finally, the forged life insurance signature and handwriting analysis report affirmed, signed by another with intent to defraud financially. Leland placed the copper mug on the wooden podium, light reflecting off the dark metal surface. He scanned the pin-drop silent room, then said slowly, each word like a nail driven into wood. Nobody cases are rare, but this one has both the body and the confession. Shifting to financials, he projected a timeline chart on screen, February 1958. Clara forged husband's signature for $50,000 insurance policy. April 17, withdrew $1,300 check to C.L. Brown. June 1959, collected full insurance payout and left Macon. Financial motive, Leland said, always draws straight lines. Preparation, action, and cover-up. That's the cold geometry of greed. Then he addressed what forensics calls pattern of behavior. From Macon hospital records, Harold hospitalized twice for morphine poisoning, 1956, and early 1958, and both times brought in by Clara. Combined with toxicology, the forensics team built a testing poisoning chain, low-dose morphine, then higher, then pure fentanyl, the final dose. She didn't snap in anger, Leland concluded. She experimented. Each near-death was a rehearsal, until perfect, in a vodka ginger drink. The final section was the confession. The large screen showed Clara's handwritten statement, trembling script. I gave him something to calm down. I never meant to kill him. Below, the Clara Whitman signature, matching exactly the forged pen strokes on the 1958 insurance policy. That confession was the final piece, fitting the entire crime structure, a belated, undeniable admission. When the prosecutor finished reading, the grand jury retired to deliberate. No one in the courtroom spoke. Through the frosted glass, only lights and nodding shadows, brief exchanges visible. Nearly an hour later, the door opened. The foreman stood, voice steady and firm. We, the grand jury of Bibb County, find sufficient evidence to indict Clara Whitman on the charge of first-degree murder by poisoning. The pronouncement fell like thunder in the gloomy autumn afternoon. Darnell closed her eyes, breathed deeply. Nearly half a century ago, Sheriff Ed Lawson wrote the final line in the file. Insufficient evidence, suspicion remains. Now those suspicions had become evident truth, proven by material, testimony, and a legal indictment. News spread like wildfire. The next morning's Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a huge headline. Georgia cold case solved after 46 years, wife indicted for murder by poison. TV stations replayed the 1958 rainy night simulation, intercut with topes of key concrete excavation footage. The anchor's voice solemn, a case thought forgotten, now decoded by technology and memory. At the GBI press conference, a reporter asked Darnell, "Do you think justice came too late?" She looked straight into the camera, voice calm. "Justice isn't measured in years, it's measured in truth." And today, truth was spoken, not just in words, but in earth, in metal, and in a copper mug. Outside, light rain covered Atlanta City. On Darnell's desk, case #580417. Whitman Herald file closed for the last time. The new note on the cover in blue ink, case closed, murder confirmed by evidence and confession, 2004. 46 years later, the Harold Whitman case officially closed. Crime confirmed, perpetrator indicted, and the Moscow Mule mug, silent evidence for half a century, finally said what it always meant to the truth. Clara Whitman's trial, or Clara Durham by her married name, opened on the morning of March 12, 2005, at Bibb County Courthouse in Macon. Outside, crowds packed the stone steps. Press, TV, and elderly locals with vague memories of the 1958 disappearance, all present. For them, this wasn't just a trial, but a piece of Georgia memory closing after nearly half a century. In the courtroom, light slanted through tall windows, casting on the wrinkled face of the 81-year-old woman in the defendant's chair. Clara wore a light gray cardigan, hair neatly pinned, hands faintly trembling on her lap. As the judge read aloud the charge, first-degree murder by poisoning, she looked straight ahead, voice weak but clear, "Not guilty. I didn't mean to kill him. It was an accident, an unintended overdose." Her court-appointed defense attorney, a young man, opened with that argument. He presented to the jury that the defendant back then was just a wife trying to help her husband sleep better during a stressful time, and the drug administration was ignorant, without intent to kill. He emphasized Clara's age, mental instability, and the nearly half-century passage making evidence vague and circumstantial. But the prosecution, led by Mark Leland, had prepared more meticulously than any prior case. He stepped to the center of the courtroom, placed the Moscow Mule mug on the wooden podium. The light reflected off the tarnished copper, silencing the gallery. "This wasn't an accident," he said, voice low and firm. "This was a plan executed meticulously over years, a systematic dose escalation, ending in death and a perfect cover-up." He presented to the jury each evidence group, with images projected on the large screen, photocopies of 1956 and 1958 Macon medical records, 2 morphine poisonings, both with Clara bringing her husband to ER, forged insurance signature, bank ledger with the $1,300 check to C.L. Brown, toxicology report detecting trace fentanyl in the copper mug. Each proof like a hammer blow. The climax came when the prosecution played the audio recording of Clara's confession from the Salt Lake interrogation. "I just wanted him to stop yelling. I gave him medicine to make him sleep. When I saw he wasn't breathing anymore, I panicked. I buried him under the concrete to keep him close to me." Her voice, hoarse, breaking in fragments, echoed through the speakers like it came from another world. A few people in the courtroom bowed their heads, unable to look. Darnell, sitting in the third row behind the prosecution, didn't take her eyes off the defendant. The old woman didn't cry, didn't react. She just pursed her lips slightly when the recording ended, as if hearing her own voice again from another life. The defense attorney countered that Mrs. Whitman had confessed candidly, without attempting to hide her actions, and fully believed her husband had only passed out from sleeping pills. But Leland simply lifted a thin file folder, voice cold, candid. After 46 years of hiding the body under concrete, after 2 prior drug trials, after signing the insurance policy with his forged signature, this wasn't carelessness, this was intent. The trial lasted 12 days. Toxicology experts, investigators, and witnesses took the stand. When the prosecution presented the 3D model reconstructing the rainy night of 1958, with the yellow porch light, wet grass, and empty wooden chair, the jury sat in silence. Step by step, The story of that night was rebuilt through science. Not a hazy memory from a century ago, but a precise timeline down to the minute. On the 13th day, both sides rested. The jury retired to deliberate at 3:15 p.m. Outside, Macon skies poured rain, drops tapping the windows like the clock of fate. 2 hours later, they returned. The foreman stood, voice trembling slightly but clear. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Clara Whitman, guilty of murder in the first degree, committed by poisoning." No cries, no collapse. Clara just closed her eyes, nodded faintly, as if she'd known the outcome all along. The next morning, the court pronounced sentence. Veteran Judge Raymond Harlan read the verdict slowly, his gravelly voice filling the packed courtroom. "Mrs. Clara Whitman, the court sentences you to life imprisonment, without parole. You took the life of your husband and concealed the crime for nearly half a century. Justice is late, but not denied." Behind him, Darnell stood motionless. All the months she'd pursued this case, from the old wooden box, Sheriff Lawson's note, to the night of exhuming the body, had led to this moment. As Clara was led away by officers, she turned her head, her gaze briefly meeting Darnell's, not resentment, not pleading, just an oddly sad look. Outside the courthouse, reporters jostled in the heavy downpour. That evening's national TV headlines were just 7 words. Justice, 46 years late, but found. In the GBI office, Darnell closed the case hash 580417 file. The cover now bore her final handwritten line. Verdict guilty, life sentence, no parole. She looked out the window, where rain fell in sheets like that night in Macon. The distant Lake Tobsovki must now be at peace, holding no more secrets in its depths. After 46 years, justice had finally returned, slow but on the right path. 2 months after the sentencing, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, released the official technical report, titled Case Hash 580417, Solved After 46 Years. The over 200-page document, bound in hardcover, detailed the entire reinvestigation process of the Harold Whitman case, from unsealing evidence in 2003 to Clara Whitman's conviction in March 2005. This wasn't just a summary report, but a standard reference for one of the most complex and long-running cold case investigations in Georgia's history. The report's introduction stated, "The Whitman case demonstrates the power of combining modern technology with classic archival materials, proving that time cannot destroy evidence, only people can forget it." In the technical sequence section, GBI specialists described each forensic step in meticulous detail. It all began with the Moscow Mule mug, preserved under seal for 46 years in Bibb County storage. The unsealing was performed under 2 recording cameras, 3 witnesses, and cross-verified against 1958 sealing wax via carbon isotope analysis to confirm authenticity. Residues inside were extracted using methanol solvent and analyzed by GCMS, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, yielding molecular signals matching fentanyl and trace morphine. The report continued with the chain of custody cross-verification process, essential for legal admissibility in court. GBI traced the full movement history of the evidence, from Sheriff Ed Lawson's hands in 1958, through Bibb County storage transferred to GBI in 1990, to opening in Atlanta in 2003. No signs of tampering, label changes, or seal breaches. This made the Moscow Mule mug, and seemingly inert object, a cornerstone legal exhibit in the case. The report's second section covered methods for re-examining old files. Specialists digitized over 600 pages of 1950s documents, including Clara's original statements and Lawson's handwritten reports. Each page was scanned with UV spectroscopy to restore faded ink, then encoded in the new 2003 cold case storage system. GBI noted, the Whitman file was one of the first tests of the Cold Case Unit program, paving the way for retrieving historical criminal data via digital forensics. The report devoted an entire chapter to behavioral pattern analysis. The team of toxicologists, criminal psychologists, and medical data experts reconstructed Clara's systematic poisoning sequence, morphine trials in 1956 and 1958. Then pure fentanyl at the disappearance. The conclusion stated, "This is Georgia's first case establishing a poison pattern model through behavioral analysis, proving deliberate repetition in substances and targets." In the appendix, GBI listed preserved evidence items: the copper mug, each double engraved watch, $1,300 check, Clara's handwritten confession, and the victim's son's DNA results, all resealed in the cold case hall vault, where only 10 cases are placed in the solved after over 40 years section. The report release press conference took place in early June 2005 at GBI Atlanta headquarters. Reporters packed the hallway, cameras aimed at the podium where Detective Laura Darnell stood, face composed but eyes still heavy. She didn't speak much, opening slowly and clearly. "We don't need time, we just need evidence that doesn't lie." Behind her, a large screen displayed case hash 580417, solved after 46 years. When she paused, a reporter asked, "What do you think made this case solvable after so long?" Darnell replied without hesitation, "Because it was so long. Time can take human memory, but it can't erase what truly exists. Metal still holds chemical traces. Paper still holds forged strokes, and sometimes, one person's silence is the strongest confession." The GBI report quickly distributed to all police academies in the state. From 2006, the Whitman Protocol, Darnell's cold case investigation model, became official curriculum, viewed as the standard for reinvestigating cases after decades. In the conclusion, the report stated, "The Whitman case proves justice doesn't lose value with years. A seemingly dead file can be revived if people still believe in data, in traces, in the logic of truth." That evening, leaving the press conference, Darnell stood on the GBI headquarters steps, watching rain fall on the pavement. She thought of Ed Lawson, the sheriff from back then who wrote the final line in the old file. "Insufficient evidence, but suspicion remains." She smiled faintly. Now that suspicion had been lifted, not by hunch, but by science, persistence, and faith that evidence never lies. As the Whitman case officially closed, the small city of Macon seemed to relearn how to breathe. After nearly half a century, thinking it all had passed, residents saw their town's name on national news, amid sensational headlines. The Moscow Mule widow case, Georgia's longest cold case solved. In the old coffee shops around Mulberry Square, everyone talked about it, some voices trembling with pity, others red-faced with outrage. Those who lived near the Whitman house back then recounted faded memories. The April rainy night, dogs barking by the lake, Harold's porch light flickering then going out. "I remember it like yesterday," an old man said on local TV. "Everyone thought he'd run off with someone else. No one imagined this." Some pitied Clara. The 81-year-old wheeled into court, cloudy eyes but still composed. They said, maybe she was lonely. Maybe it was just an accident. But most were outraged. Local papers' letter sections overflowed. Justice came late, but at least it came. One wrote, "We used to drink Moscow Mules at Harold's bar. Now every time I see a copper mug, I just think of the sin." The story sparked statewide debate in Georgia on ethics, time, and justice. Law schools invited GBI experts to lecture. Media constantly referenced Whitman as a new symbol for cold case breakthroughs. On TV, images of Detective Laura Darnell, the young woman under Atlanta rain, saying, "We don't need time, just evidence that doesn't lie," became an icon of professional persistence. But the real ripple wasn't in the media, but where it all began, the small house by Lake Tobsufki. After Harold's remains were identified and reburied in church rites, his 3 children, David, Samuel, and Ruth, returned to the old home, unvisited since leaving Macon in 1960. The house was temporarily restored, peeling paint, old wooden doors, but the porch remained in its original spot. Early morning, still air, only frogs croaking from the lake. The 3 siblings stood together, each holding a white lily branch. David, the eldest, now over 60, placed the bouquet exactly where the old file noted, where the last cigarette glow was seen. He said nothing, just lightly touched the porch railing, wood cold and damp. Ruth, the youngest daughter, burst into tears. She whispered, as if to the air itself, "Dad, they've finally found you." Bibb County Police fenced off the mansion site where the remains were found, turning it into a small memorial. A year later, St. Paul's Church in Macon held a remembrance service for Harold Whitman. Outside the church, a granite plaque was erected with a simple engraving, "He vanished in 1958. Truth surfaced in 2004. Below the words, a small GBI emblem and cross symbol. Locals brought flowers to lay around the plaque. Many who never knew Harold still stood silently for a long time. In the service, the pastor spoke slowly. God may forgive sinful souls, but people must answer to truth. For only truth can save the memories of the forgotten. In the back row, Darnell sat quietly. Not in uniform, just a simple brown coat. As everyone left, she approached the plaque, placing a single rose branch on it. Beside the engraving, 1958. 2004, she whispered, "Sheriff Lawson was right. Every suspicion has its soul." On national TV, CBS and CNN documentaries replayed the case under the unified title, The Moscow Mule Widow Case. The story of a wife ending her husband with a cocktail mug became fodder for dozens of articles, podcasts, and investigative shows. Some editors called it the case that redefined delayed justice. In one interview, Darnell said just one short sentence, "I don't think I won, I just think I finished what came before." That year, at GBI Atlanta headquarters, a small exhibit opened in the hallway leading to the Cold Case Unit Hall, showcasing special evidence. In case number 7, under soft golden light, sat the Moscow Mule copper mug, the metal tarnished, rim worn by years, but on the base, the case number #580417 was newly laser engraved, resolved 2004. Beside it, a small plaque noted, "Exhibit of Truth, Moscow Mule Mug, Evidence Confirming the Harold Whitman Murder, Macon, Georgia. Symbol of justice that doesn't die with time." Visitors lingered longer before that case than others. Some were law students, some young officers new to the force, others just curious locals. They saw no blood or tragedy, just an old mug ordinary enough for any kitchen, but powerful enough to rewrite a state's forensic history. As hallway lights dimmed in the evening, that case stayed lit with its own bulb, shining on the antique copper surface. Darnell occasionally returned to look, each time standing still for a long moment. In that reflection, she glimpsed Sheriff Lawson's shadow, the man who sealed the mug in 1958, and his words in the old report, "Insufficient evidence, suspicion remains." Now, the suspicion had its answer. Justice had spoken, and the copper mug remained, a silent witness to time, reminding all that truth can be buried, but never lost. In the final light, shining on the dull metal surface, reflecting the investigator's face and those who had fallen, the copper mug was more than evidence. It was a symbol of justice, of persistence, and of the promise that no crime lives forever in the shadows. The story of the Moscow Mule widow case isn't just a 1958 Georgia case cracked after 46 years. It touches on the habits, vulnerabilities, and civic responsibilities of America today. Harold vanished after a Moscow Mule in a copper mug that later showed traces of fentanyl and morphine, reminds us that villains often exploit the most familiar things. Clara, forging the $50,000 insurance signature and withdrawing a $1,300 check to Nurse C.L. Brown, shows financial transparency in families is mandatory. Verify signatures in person, set transaction alerts, and don't let one person hold all the papers. Harold's 2 hospitalizations for morphine poisoning, 1956, 1958. Then silence is a lesson on health. If symptoms repeat, seek independent medical opinion, and manage sedatives, opioids, with locked cabinets, dosage logs. Bring unlabeled meds to pharmacists for checks. For communities, neighbor Jensen hearing arguments at 11:40 p.m. If you hear escalating violence, Call 911. Log times, descriptions, plates. It's just family business can cost lives. On justice, Sheriff Lawson maintaining chain of custody. Laura Darnell using GCMS and GPR. Reminds that documents, photos, small evidence, like the HW engraved lighter, need disciplined preservation. Digitize papers, cloud backups. Finally, when the church engraved he vanished in 1958. Truth surfaced in 2004. The message for us is truth needs time and persistent people. Serve on juries, support victims, and don't let silence stand for moral choice. Thank you for following the story of the Moscow Mule widow case, where truth finally surfaced after nearly half a century buried. Subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring more chilling cold cases where justice may come late, but never disappears.